Okay, so hello everyone and welcome back or welcome to our platform Reset Revolution. My name is Morgana Angeli and today we're doing something a little bit different than usual. I'm joined by Ruby Nwose, Emily Riddle, and Maria Leon, and we're doing a panel type thing. We're going to be discussing the impacts that misinformation and miseducation on the LGBTQ plus community has on the members of that community. So if you guys just want to quickly introduce yourselves.
Sure. I'm Ruby. I go to ZIS in Zurich, and I'm gay, so I was like, yeah, this is going to be a fun time. Let's talk about oppression.
Hello, I am Maria. I'm Maria Leon. I'm from Madrid, but I'm studying right now a freshman of psychology in the University of Amsterdam. And I am bi.
And my name's Emily. I am a senior in high school in Massachusetts in the United States. I'm non-binary and I'm also bisexual. And I thought my perspective could be interesting when talking about the misinformation and miseducation surrounding both gender identity and sexual orientation.
Thank you very much. So the structure that we're going to follow for this is I'm going to be asking questions, but any of the three can interject and comment on what we're going to be talking about. So firstly, Ruby, you're living in Zurich, but you're from the States, and I think you lived there for a while too. So I was wondering, how do you think that the education on the LGBTQ plus community differs between the American and international school system?
Yeah, so in the US, I was in public school systems. So I lived in California and New Jersey, and I lived there from birth up until I was 14, so 14 years roughly. And I think it to an extent it differs, but there are some similarities. And right now I'm in a private school type of scenario rather than a public school, so I think that impacts it a lot too. But in the US, we had our regular sex education by the time we were in 6th or 7th grade, but most of it was surrounded with drug awareness and like STDs and stuff like that were important and are important. But there was no facilitation of conversation around any of the LGBTQ plus community. So no one would mention it. It would be almost a taboo to say anything about it. If you asked about it, you were going to be laughed at. You would probably walk into the hallway and someone would probably push you into a locker or something. It wasn't something that was really talked about. And so when I kind of came out in that setting, it wasn't even when other people came out, it wasn't talked about. Here at my school now, we have small conversations about it outside of an academic setting. We have these things called advisories where we meet like 3 times a week. And sometimes that's a topic of conversation that comes up, but it's never really sex education based. When we did have sex education in grades 9 and 10, I actually went and asked the question, why don't they teach about LGBTQ plus sex? Why don't they teach about anything to do with the community? Because there's going to be people that are confused. And the answer I got back was, well, I'm not qualified. I'm not gay. I don't know anything about it. And why should I be teaching it? And so there's similarities in the context of they don't really know much about it and they don't want to teach it, but it was a lot more acceptable to talk about it in the international school than it was in the American public school.
Thank you for that. Emily, you're currently studying in an American school and you're doing the high school years, which Ruby didn't do. How do you think it differs then in high school? Do you think it gets progressively better, or are we still in that place where no one is being taught about non-heterosexual, non-cis sex ed?
So I think in middle school, it was like really just like the basics, like anatomy, and that was basically it. And then in high school, there really was, despite my town being like priding itself on being like relatively liberal, and also I live in a liberal state in Massachusetts, but despite that fact, there's really not that many resources given, particularly for like safe sex and STD and STI prevention, specifically for LGBTQ students. And even like, and I love my health teacher, but unfortunately she didn't really go much into safe sex pertaining to LGBTQ plus people. And we were kind of like given a sheet almost of like gender identity and sexual orientations, but there was never any like deep delves into what those actually mean and how to break down those stereotypes that can often be associated with misinformation. So I think there's just like there's just a lot of misinformation that I think can go around even in this like little microcosm of like this liberal environment. And I don't have the international experience of going somewhere else. But I mean, we do have a GSA and the like, but nonetheless, it's still kind of like, it's not talked about very much. It's a little bit like hush hush, like people are open about it. But you know, there are some things that people tend to like stray away from, especially like administrators in particular, which I think is a huge problem, definitely. And then it can lead to, and it can just lead to harm, especially for these LGBTQ students. So.
I completely agree. And sadly, it's not just a situation in the States. It also happens in European countries where, in my experience in Spain, where there's barely no sex education. Like they teach us about the basics of, yeah, okay, women, this is what happens to you. Men, this is what happens to you. But it's a conversation that they don't want to have with us because they believe that it's not as important as we're kids. But especially due to the internet and technology, we are exposed to a lot of misleading information, and it would have been so helpful to have some adult guidance in the whole process.
To then discuss how this misinformation and miseducation affects LGBTQ, the community, but also more specifically the youth, how do you think that not being taught, or rather not teaching those around you, affects you in a school environment? Yeah, does anyone who wants to?
I think it's a case of when we don't. It's similar with racism too. When we don't enlighten each other on everyone's culture, which is why international schools have that type of power to do so, because there tends to be a lot of people from a lot of different places. But in general, when you're not educating a group of people on a minority or something that isn't considered normal or isn't in society our norm, it can be destructive to the mental health of a lot of youth. But it also allows our generations to grow up believing that it's not as important and it doesn't deserve the same stature as everything else in our society. So I think just purely from not talking about it, you ultimately create this idea in society that there are types of people that are lesser because we don't talk about them enough.
I completely agree with you. And most importantly, in youth, psychologically, that effect of alienation since you grew up, being completely isolated from your peers, can lead to mental illnesses like anxiety, depression, and a lot of trauma due to the abuse of just being completely ignored from what you would consider your world. When you grow up in a class where people just don't acknowledge your existence or this part of you that you are discovering, it's very hard to keep developing yourself in that environment. And that's why it is so important to change the way education works.
I totally agree with both of what you just said. Another thing is like what is integrated into our curriculum, like what are we consuming, particularly like in our English classes, for example, and like are we diversifying the voices that we are hearing about, and who are our educators? Do we have people of color? I have never had a person of color as a teacher ever in my high school, despite us like promoting diversity and such. I'm not learning from people of color, and I'm not learning from these diverse perspectives. And I've never had an LGBTQ teacher either. There's no LGBTQ history whatsoever within like our history curriculums, for example, which just further pushes the notion that this is some sort of like new age thing, when in actuality, like gender variance and like sexual expression have existed for millennia. And this is just completely disregarded in our school system, which I think is extremely unfortunate and super harmful for these students who are not learning about their history.
I completely agree with everything all three of you said. Something that I have noticed is recurring is more like when people come out, their friends will be like, I don't care, like, don't worry, I don't care. And do you think that that could have negative impacts on the person coming out? The notion of, I don't care, you're the same to me, like nothing changed. The idea of nothing changing. Do you think that, I don't know, could that have anything to do with anything?
I don't know who wants to unmute themselves first. I was just gonna pop in here and just say it depends on the person and their situation. For someone like me who has an incredibly supportive immediate family, not so much my extended, but my immediate, I've been very, very fortunate and very, very lucky to have such a wonderful backup behind me. And so when I have come out to, like when I came out to my best friend a few years ago, his reaction was like, yeah, I don't care. Like, you're the same person to me. And mentally that helped me. That made me feel more normal. For other people who might not have that background in which they feel supported, it can be a case of where they want people to care about it, not in a negative way, but they want them to be like, oh, that's great. Let's talk about it. Let's have a conversation. And then it facilitates something that's even more positive for that person where it's lacking in their family. So I think it actually depends on the environment they're in, where they are in their situation.
In my experience, I realized that when people told me, yeah, I don't care, you're the same to me, they didn't really mean it. I grew up in a not so LGBT friendly environment, and I realized that when people told me, oh, you're the same to me, it's fine, it was an excuse for, oh, I'd rather not know. And in the end, what that caused was a lot of misinformation for them about what being LGBT is and the lifestyle that comes with it, because it's nothing wrong, nothing disgusting, not like the media has portrayed us for centuries before now, that is starting to change. So I do think that it would have been a lot better for people to be curious instead of neglecting of that reality of someone being LGBT.
Definitely. I think my like two phases, I guess, of coming out, I think for sexual orientation and for gender identity were completely different. I think for sexual orientation, I kind of got like, oh, like, you know, we still love you, or kind of like the I don't care, oh, like kind of like a kind of like a nod of the head. It was very casual, at least in my experience, and I'm super grateful for that, that I'm in a welcoming environment where I feel like safe to do so, because, and I don't take that lightly. But I think with gender identity in particular, I'm not as open about it. And I've only told like a couple of my friends, to be honest. I'm very like closed off in that regard because I don't feel comfortable expressing my gender identity as much. Not that I think that I would be subjected to violence, but in regards to like the misinformation that has been spread about it. And I think when I have come out, they've been just super curious, which is really nice. They're not like, oh, I don't care, which is great. And I feel like because this kind of thing is a lot more nuanced, I find, than sexual orientation, because there's a lot more information spread about that. Misinformation nonetheless, but people are a little bit more open, I think, in regards to understanding sexuality than they are to just like transness in general. And it's actually really exciting because to, you know, have to explain it, I guess, to people, because it's just such a, I don't know, a beautiful experience for me. And I just love sharing it. I know that I cannot speak for all trans people in this regard, because I know people sometimes are uncomfortable with sharing their gender identity with others, or having to explain it. But I think I'm helping to curb the misinformation that's being spread, you know, through my anecdotal experience. So
that's really nice. It's a really nice anecdote, and also like the concept of it being nice to explain it to people and to be able to inform people. And that's kind of what we're doing right now. by sharing this video. So what do you guys think are the main misconceptions or misinformations that are spread about the LGBTQ plus community? At least with your experience, what have you found that people often thought that was completely wrong? Yeah.
There's a lot. I mean, I could go on probably for hours about this kind of stuff. I'm going to just mention really quick now. With gender identity, I would love to hear from everyone else on this, because quite honestly, I haven't had too much of a struggle with gender identity at all. And so that aspect of it, like it was mentioned, it is very nuanced. And so that in itself has to be talked about individually. But from a sexual identity, sexual orientation standpoint, there's so much stuff, and that is a spectrum itself. So there's the extreme radicalism of like, you can't take care of kids, and religiously it's a sin and all that kind of stuff. And then there's smaller things like, oh, well, if you're a gay man, you can't play sports. Like just those kinds of little tiny stereotypes that build up everything. If you're a gay woman, you're expected to be masculine and like male presenting almost, rather than more feminine, which is just completely backwards in my head. But overall, I think little stereotypes really build up the whole stigma around it. And then there are those two extremes and those radicals on both sides.
Completely. I realized in my experience, there's a lot of a stigma with being bisexual, you know, the you can't choose trope, and the you're unfaithful because you like your gender and other genders. Yeah. It's complicated to be in a relationship and grow up in an environment where you're expected just because of your sexual identity to be a horrible human being. Someone who doesn't like choose, someone who can't choose a partner, or someone who just doesn't want to commit to anything. That stigma is so harmful, especially for girls growing up. And the people who say you're confused is just a phase. It's not a phase if it continues, and if it is a phase, if it would be a phase, then there's nothing wrong with it. So the situation where there's a lot of stigma for being bi, for being able to express your identity however you want, it's so harmful to people growing up in that environment, I think.
Totally. And I feel like there's this weird dichotomy of just people, the entirety of the LGBTQ community, being like predatory, and also at the same time being hyper fetishized, particularly like gay men, and then also like queer men, especially bi women, I find. And I think all the stereotypes that you touched on are so true, and I've heard almost all of them in my personal experience. And then I feel like especially with like any identity that falls under like the transgender umbrella, it's extremely nuanced depending on whether you experience transness from like a binary perspective or from a non-binary perspective, like myself. And honestly, I think people are just really afraid to talk about it because it's known as like a universalized experience. I find that it is with like sexuality. And I can't speak for people who experience it from like a binary perspective. From like a non-binary perspective, I feel like I'm completely isolated, just in my either in my own community or from like other cis people in general, because my goal is not to be cis. Like I think sometimes, like I think particularly for cis people who view trans people as just like wanting to be cis, and while it's true that some binary trans people would like to look cis or be cis passing, that's sometimes not the goal. The goal is to just freely express yourself and be one with your own identity and have that be reciprocated by other people and be accepted by other people. And I think this really has to do a lot with like the lack of media representation, and the lack of literature that people read, and the lack of perspectives that people get, particularly from trans people and also from other queer people as well. And I think, and just being afraid to ask. like, although some people are not as open to being asked these questions, which I completely understand, ask me as many questions as you want. I am totally open to it. And I find that me, myself, I'm like a little missionary, I guess, trying to, you know, uncover these stereotypes. And I want to, with my own experience, help people to educate themselves and prevent people from doing microaggressions against other people within our community.
Yeah, just for our followers, could you quickly explain what non-binary and binary means? Because it just came to me that maybe not everyone knows some of these terms.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so transness is basically anything that is not cis. So if you're not cisgender and you don't identify with the gender that you were assigned with at birth, and so there's a multitude of gender identities under this trans umbrella. And then so there's binary transness, which basically means if you identify as either a transgender woman or a transgender man and you present as such. And non-binary basically means that you reject both of these notions, or you identify with both masculinity and femininity and womanhood and manhood. So it's a really nuanced experience depending on where you fall on this gender spectrum. I know for myself, I feel detached from both gender identities, or at least like widely considered gender identities. And I just kind of want to be and not be associated with gender whatsoever. But I know that this isn't the case, especially cross-culturally. A lot of cultures like don't adhere to like being cisgender, and they have different understandings of gender, and this can fall within like the non-binary category, although this is kind of like a westernized idea of what gender is, and this is like my personal experience, but trying to fit these different cultures, genders under this like westernized version is it's just not applicable. But just for the people in the West, I guess, that is what binary transness and then non-binary transness is like dumbed down to be.
Thank you very much. Drawing from your experiences, all three of you, have you ever been victim of discrimination or marginalization, which is a little different, but in your schools or in your community environment within your country or your city or your family? Yeah.
Again, I don't know who wants to go first, so I'll just start talking. From a school perspective, again, my two experiences in two different places. So public American school is different from my kind of private international school in Switzerland. And in the US, just the oppressive nature of not necessarily the authority and the teachers there, but the way that children and other students were taught to handle my identity was not the correct way. It was almost like I have to thank my best friend for being there and staying with me because he didn't see a problem, but a lot of other kids found that they would much rather avoid me, exclude me from certain like group projects. I'd have to do a lot of group projects on my own. I'd be excluded from any physical activity. I'd get picked last. All of those kinds of things in the American public school that I was in my middle school, happened. Here in the international school, it's a lot different. There are actually rules within our handbook that won't allow that to happen. And if it does, there are severe punishments for it. And that can be anywhere from detentions to expulsions, depending on how that student would have acted towards me. And in Switzerland itself, any hate speech and hate crime can land you in prison or jail. And so I think that culture itself, being in this country, having that as a national law impacts a lot of what we do in our international school too. So, and that might also be a high school thing. The age that we're at, I think we're a lot more accepting as people, and we can open up and expand our minds, and we accept that. So internationally here, it's a lot different. But I've been a victim of a few different types and ways of discrimination, and I've been ostracized a few times, but here it's a lot better.
Um, in my experience, I've been discriminated in the way that I've grown up in a very religious environment. So every time that I try to educate myself by asking some people older than me or some friends of mine, I realized that they weren't as interested in getting to know this other side of reality that doesn't come into the bubble of a religious conservative school. So when I educated myself and I decided to come out, it was a tricky situation because even though some people were supportive in the way of, oh, poor thing, let's not talk about it, there were other people that were directly discriminating and they just truly thought of it, but mostly because of misinformation. Most of them were not rude or mean. They were just completely uninformed, and they truly thought, because of what they've been taught in school and at home, that it was a disease and it was something bad that could truly hurt me. So it was a very complicated scenario to live that isolation of, let's not get near her, she's the odd one out.
I think my experience is slightly different just because of where I've grown up. So I have grown up in Massachusetts. I've lived here my whole life, and it's a blue state, so it's pretty democratic. And my town is extremely liberal. And when I just came out, I was not met with negativity whatsoever. I think it was more of like an internal conflict. I caused myself more harm than others did to me. And I'm super grateful that I was really welcomed with warm arms into my environment. I still had to kind of break down these misconceptions like with my family, but at least with my peers in general, everybody was completely chill with it, or at least like some people don't even know. Like I don't really talk about it all that much. And then some people were like, "Oh, you're bi? That's cool." And then there's nothing else after that. There's no follow up, which I think is really nice. And I'm super grateful, and I understand how privileged I am to have had that type of experience. Although now I think with gender identity, I'm not nearly as open about it because there are a lot more misconceptions when it comes to that, and I don't feel I don't know, I don't feel as open about expressing that or telling other people because I don't want to subject myself to that kind of discrimination, I guess. Although it wouldn't be as bad if I lived in like another part of the United States, for example, where discrimination is more just openly accepted, I'd like to say. Um, and yeah, that's pretty much it.
So one of the questions that came up in the question box that was posted before this interview was, what are harmful stereotypes that the media and films partake in when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community? Because I think in the recent years, it's been getting increasingly better, but there are some series or movies that over-sexualize bisexuality or queer women and stuff like that. So what are your opinions on this?
I think there's in general like a lot of like queer baiting and there was a Netflix show, and I wish I could remember the name, but I'm sorry I can't. It was about like these two lesbian women who got together, and it was like meant to be a comedy, but the way I took it, like watching the whole series, it was very destructive. Like one of the women was like previously had a like really hard time with drugs, and she was like super rough around the edges, and she was also super masculine in comparison to her very feminine girlfriend. And it was just a lot of like mess that kind of you would see in some relationships, but it was almost too much. Like it was almost like attacking the fact that they had a relationship in the first place. But aside from that, I think there's even moving into movies and TV shows that we perceive as doing it right, there's also like an exclusion of queer people of color, especially when you go into gender identity and you have TV shows and movies about gender identity. I find it annoying myself because I have a few friends of mine who identify as non-binary or trans, and you want to see that kind of stuff, but there's not enough representation of queer people of color, trans people of color, when in reality, the whole of the community that we have, a lot of our rights today were based upon trans women of color. And so I feel like in general, the stereotypes that are there, they're terrible and they do still exist, but just the lack of representation of what is actually in our world and what is beautiful in our world and what exists in our world, it's just so underrepresented, it's ridiculous.
There are many tropes in today's media that make a ridicule of the LGBT community, especially the coming out story. We only hear the coming out story in most TV and in film in today's world. We only see the typical girl or guy, not once a non-binary person that is their coming out time, and everyone's suddenly so supportive. There are some rough times, but everything's fine. It's so unrealistic, and when there are elaborate, in-depth queer people represented, they're always killed in the first hour of the movie, or they're a completely backstory character and they call it with a little bit of spice. This business of the media we're in is developing a lot better now due to social media like Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, where people are expressing themselves without the production in it. But there is a lot of progress we have to make Hollywood and other big platforms be a lot more open about it.
Definitely. I find that a huge issue is like who is representing us in the media? Cis people and straight people are playing these queer characters. And honestly, like coming from someone who is like both outside of the like gender binary and also someone just who is queer in general, like it's just not as authentic. And you can tell, like you can tell when these people have not experienced what you've experienced and are trying to portray it in this like raw way. And it's just very disingenuous and honestly just a slap in the face to queer actors in general and just queer people in general. And I find that particularly like what Ruby was talking about earlier, I find that when there are queer like relationships in media, it's often portrayed in this like heteronormative way. So there's the masculine person and there's the feminine person, and there's never like two masc people or two femme people, and it's for the entertainment and for the comfort of cishet people. It's not for queer people, and it's honestly it's awful just to see that. And yeah, and I find that like what stories are being portrayed, if any, are those of people who have done the least for our community and yet are represented the most, and those who are the statistically the least likely to be subjected to violence, like trans like women of color, particularly Black trans women of color. Their life expectancy is 35, and they are grossly underrepresented whenever we talk about just in literature in general and both in just media consumption in general. I think Pose is a great example of that, and I'm so happy that shows like that exist. But I think we really need to talk about how queerness is really only acceptable if it's white. White queerness is the only acceptability, and I don't think like even as a community and also just like cishet people in general are not willing to face that yet, and we need to break that down for who we're portraying in our shows and in our stories.
Yeah, I was just gonna add something that I was just thinking about was shows on Netflix, like we see a lot of RuPaul's Drag Race and Queer Eye. I feel like a lot of shows, when they do represent more of that reality TV style where it's like actual people and they're not actors, it's at the like radical end, or like the flamboyancy of it is super high rather than. And I guess maybe some people are going to be like, well, if it's more domestic and it's more calmed down, not many people are going to want to watch it. But I would hazard a guess that a lot of queer people are going to want to watch just everyday life of queer people, and that includes gender identity and sexual orientation, and that's going to actually teach a lot of youth that it can be something that is accepted, that's normal, that's easy and domestic, and it's not. You don't have to walk around and just be super flamboyant all the time to be gay. You can be interested in just everyday, you don't have to be like super out there to be gay. You can just be you, and it doesn't, it doesn't cost anything. And so I just feel like flamboyancy in general is what we're classified as, and if it's not there, then no one's going to watch it, and that's just not true.
Sadly, I truly believe that those queer TV shows, even though they're very entertaining, I'm the first one fan of RuPaul's Drag Race, they're meant for cis heterosexual people. They're meant to be entertaining for them, flashy for them, new to them. Even though they're representing us, they're not for us. They're not trying to portray us in an honest way.
Definitely. And while I totally agree, like I find them really entertaining and I think it's a great glimpse into like that aspect of the community, I really think domesticity is the first step to normalization. Like if you ostracize yourself and make it like the other solely for the entertainment of yourself and not, thinking like, oh, these people just exist like in my everyday life and they're not for my entertainment or for my consumption or for my fetishization even, like they're not for me, they are people that exist among me. And when we don't portray them like in this like everyday life and doing like other things like outside of being queer, like obviously being queer is a super huge part of our identities, but there are things that like exist, there are things that exist outside of that.
Really well said. Another question that was asked was, in what ways do you think that the trauma or the misinformation can be minimized, especially by educators or peers within school environments? Because there's a lot of high school students watching this and also educators, high school, middle school educators. And in what ways can we help them understand what they can do to help the community besides changing curricula? And
Being an ally is one of the first things you can do. And what I mean by that isn't just saying, oh yeah, that's okay in my classroom. Well, it should be okay in your classroom. That should be a standard. That's like the bare minimum. It should be okay in the school. It should be okay in the neighborhood, in the community. What I think from my experience would have been great for my teachers to do would be not to call me out when we're talking about a queer person in school, not to kind of look at me or have everyone use me as an example, but instead take public resource, go out in your free time and educate yourself. Don't have the whole class asking you questions about my identity, because one, it's uncomfortable for me personally, and two, I'm cis. I don't know anything or much of anything past respect for people who identify outside the gender spectrum or on a different place other than just cis. I don't know a lot about gender identity as a cis person. And so for me, trying to use the one queer person as a resource is like not the way to go. Educating yourself, educating your friends and your students or your faculty, having people professionally come in and talk about it, people who study the psychology behind it, people who are queer and can give experience, and like specialize in and have experience talking to youth about those kinds of things is really, really important. And then, in your academia, actually integrating it in there. Like one of my math teachers, or in our school, what he does is he makes people, when they write a test, everything that they write on, they put their name and then they put their preferred pronouns, and he will use that for the rest of the year. But that needs to be regular and mandatory throughout the whole school. So just so we can normalize those things.
I believe that I completely agree with you, Ruby. I also believe that teachers and students, being allies, they have to truly represent the complete, I don't think those jokes are funny, thank you idea. When teachers used to completely ignore the slurs people used to throw in class, or they would just look at the other side when someone used to talk to me in a non-nice way, if they would have corrected them and punished them for it and just basically teach an area of respect around, doesn't matter if you believe something another person does is right or wrong, that doesn't give you any type of authority to treat them however you please.
Definitely. I totally agree. And kind of going back to what Ruby said, acceptance is the bare minimum. That is what is to be expected and what should be expected. And I think what needs to be like of more emphasis is kind of the like decolonization of your thoughts and of your mind and within your schools, and like what is the root of this homophobia and this transphobia that is in my community, whether it be explicit, implicit, etc. And a scary statistic is that 40% of LGBTQ youth has considered or committed suicide, at least, or at least had one attempt. And this goes up for people who are trans. And it's like acceptance should be the bare minimum. There's people's like life on the line. Like people would rather die than live an inauthentic life, both for people who like have a different sexual orientation, but specifically for gender identity in particular. So it's like you need to be able to offer these resources to your queer students, because if you don't, you could be like a part of like prolonging their struggle. And I think that it's like almost obligatory for people who have this kind of power as educators to promote outreach for these really vulnerable students.
And if I can just slip in again and just say, I think at the end of the day, one of the things that should be taught from a young age is the basic notion of respect, having respect for different opinions, having respect for different cultures, sexuality, gender identity. I mean, within your own country, if you don't leave your own country, you're not going to know what other cultures are out there. And that's going to apply if you're in a cis-het system where that's what is the norm and we don't teach anything about it. You're not going to know anything outside of it. So just understanding and having respect for things that you might not understand can greatly improve the situation that we have as queer people.
Exactly. And sorry to add just like one last thing. I feel like even if you don't have anyone in your life who is trans or queer, etc., like you still should be educated about this, and you shouldn't use your token queer friend for all of your information, because that's not their job. I mean, that sounds really harsh, but I'm perfectly willing to educate people and I love to do so. So I don't mind it at all, but it's not obligatory for me to do so. And that's just me being very frank about this, because it can actually be harmful, especially if you're not a part of a certain community trying to educate your friends. You might actually be perpetuating this misinformation onto your friends and then just further, I don't know, further causing harm, especially if you're talking about something that you don't directly experience. So actively searching out your own resources should be a huge part of it, not just like accepting this like base understanding of things, because this is why there's so much misinformation spread, because you don't understand the nuances, or you don't care enough. You simply don't care enough to look for other resources, both anecdotal, both like psychologically, both like biologically, all these studies, et cetera, and I think there's a lot of like complicity on the part of cishet people, because they find that it's like, oh, if it doesn't apply to me, then I don't care. That might not be explicitly what it is, but that's implicitly what it is. And you have to think about that when it comes to education as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think I really am, I try my hardest every day. I understand that there are so many other cultures around me and so many different identities around me. And as a queer person of color, I think that's implanted in my mind more, especially because I'm mixed race too. There's like two complete split sides of my family as well. So there's this whole universe around me of just different. And I love that. I love being around completely different people. It's like the best thing in the world. And you learn so much stuff. But one of the things that I'm trying to educate myself on more is queer people in the context of queer people we don't, or society doesn't expect. Muslim women who are queer, we don't see that ever, like in media, and that annoys me to such a high extent. But even just gender identity in general, I'm really trying to like get myself educated about it and understand it, not just for my benefit, because that benefits me as a person knowing more and more information, but it also is going to benefit the rest of our society if we just know more about other people and we accept more about other people. And we admit that we don't know a lot about that kind of stuff. I think half of the problem is just not admitting that we want to know or we don't know. And so admitting that you don't know or admitting that you might be wrong about something is one of the first steps to researching and educating yourself and then making society a much safer place for everybody.
Yeah, no, definitely. I just want to reiterate how thankful I am as well. And like, because I know like if I was somewhere else or if I was like just a different person in general, I might not have this, like, I would not have this privilege. Or if I was a part of like another minority group, like I might not be in that same environment. And also I think intersectionality is just not as acknowledged, because the way in which you experience like both oppression and also just like your experience with like your sexual orientation and gender identity, et cetera, is based off of other factors like income, race, neurodivergency, mental illness, like all of these different things really affect how you experience these things. And there's such like a variance that I think is just both underrepresented and just really not talked about. Like for example, like people who are neurodivergent, like divergent, experience gender differently, and like that's just not like a known common thing. And I feel like once, although like what you said, like it's not obligatory for us to talk about it, when we're in this welcoming environment, people are more apt to do so and more apt to talk about their experiences. And with technology and this new age of education, I think that there's also, you know, more violence being portrayed, but I think at the same time, there's also, I don't know, more education. And I find like, I don't know, I find that I'm like, I feel it's like obligatory for me, at least in my life, to do that because I know that it directly affects me and also other people who may not be as privileged as I am.